What up, YouTube? It's your girl, Sukablat here! Hey guys, my name is SukaBOT1, and my next year-end lists are gonna be of 2008. Next logical step, right? However, before we get to that, I wanted to do something a little different. I wanted to give you an idea of my musical tastes in 2008. When I was 13 and 14, my tastes weren't dictated by what was charting or what was playing on the radio. Instead, they were dictated by Guitar Hero. I had gotten Guitar Hero 3 for the Wii in Christmas of 2007, and I got hooked instantly. I played this thing religiously and got myself obsessed with nearly all the songs featured in the game. I bought the songs I liked off iTunes and put them on a playlist and listened to them on my iPod Nano any chance I got. It was a different time, shut up. And I went back and listened to the songs from the previous games on YouTube since I didn't have a PS2 at the time and couldn't play those games. In fact, I still don't have a PS2. Why don't I have a PS2? And even though at the time I wasn't able to get the DLC for Guitar Hero, I still kept up with all the songs that got released for both it and Rock Band, and sometimes that included full albums. Stuff like Doolittle by Pixies, Texas Flood by Stevie Ray Vaughan, Blood Sugar Sex Magic by Red Hot Chili Peppers, and of course, the album I'm going to be talking about today, Death Magnetic by Metallica. I remember the rollout for this album being massive, and there were a lot of reasons to get excited for it. First off, it was the first album by the band to feature bassist Robert Trujillo, who had joined the band in 2003 after the recording of Saint Anger had concluded. Prior to playing for Metallica, Trujillo played with Ozzy Osbourne, so you know he's legit. It was also their first album to be produced by the legendary Rick Rubin, with production credits that include the Beastie Boys, Black Sabbath, Adele, Eminem, Slayer, Lady Gaga, Red Hot Chili Peppers. You know what? Just include the Wikipedia screenshot. It's insane how many artists in different genres this guy has worked with. You could probably make a 6 Degrees of Kevin Bacon game with this guy. Anyway, back on track. Most importantly, Death Magnetic marks a return to the band's roots. When you think about it, this was the first album in the vein of the band's original work in 20 years, since 1988's And Justice for All. Since that album, Metallica had made their sound more mainstream accessible and radio-friendly with their self-titled Black Album, started to fuse blues and other styles with metal for Load and Reload, and alienated just about everyone with the unapologetically brutal, maddening, and hard-to-listen to Saint Anger. With Death Magnetic, though, the band were finally returning to their thrash metal beginnings. Progressive song structures, dark but tasteful writing, brutal guitar solos, and intense drum work. But at the time this album came out, I knew very little about all this history, and I wasn't really much of a fan of these guys at the time. In fact, I kinda hated One the first few times I heard it, but I suspect that was because I couldn't pass it on hard in Guitar Hero 3. Yes, hard. The first part of that solo is still brutal for me today. But as I warmed up to the song and others I had heard through Guitar Hero and Rock Band, I got excited for this album, especially with it releasing on Guitar Hero 3 as DLC the same day of the album proper dropping, on September 12th, 2008. And for me personally, this was the album that got me into Metallica. When Death Magnetic came out, even though at the time I couldn't download it on my Wii, and even now can't download it because the damn music store is gone, I listened to this album often in middle school. I can only imagine the talks I would have gotten from my parents if they found out I listened to this stuff at that young of an age. I mean, there's no swearing throughout any of this album, but, you know, violence and death, yada yada yada. But does this album still hold up today? To answer this question, I decided to go back and listen through most of Metallica's studio discography, with the exception of Lulu, because no. Kill 'Em All was a lot of fun. It offered quick, intense guitar riffs, but the songs don't tout the dark undertones the band is known for today. Ride the Lightning starts to develop those dark undertones, and it's an absolute classic for that. Master of Puppets perfected that formula and made what's deservedly the most celebrated album in Metallica's discography. And Justice for All put further emphasis on doom and gloom, making the band's style more progressive and making an intense listen in the process. Of course, there's only so much praise I can give it when the bass is intentionally mixed to be inaudible, and the fact that they're refusing to fix this in the upcoming remaster is infuriating. Search up Injustice for Jason on YouTube, because these songs sound so much better with the bass track in. Metallica, or the Black Album, was better than I expected. I thought most of it would be pretty watered down, but the band's intensity is still on display, even when appealing to a more mainstream audience. I was very impressed with this. Load and Reload were slogs to get through, with odd mixing choices and song structures that ultimately go nowhere. There are highlights, especially with King Nothing on Load and Fuel on Reload, but the rest just kinda run together. Saint Anger is a beast, and one I admittedly could not get through in one sitting, but I still ended up enjoying the album despite its faults, and can appreciate it as the most raw and uncomfortable Metallica has ever gotten. It's not for everyone, and I get exactly why it's hated, but it struck something with me. And jumping ahead to their 2016 album Hardwired to Self-Destruct, I think it's a good album, but with too many slow songs that kind of cut their momentum for me. It is good, but they've done better. But now, it's time to go in-depth on the album that turned me into a fan of this band, track by track, taking both the good and the bad into account. Let's go. This album starts off with a slow but steady heartbeat as ethereal guitars come in to set the tone for the rest of the song and album. It builds quite well with a slow, crunchy chord progression and later addition of drums. Then the pace picks up a minute and a half in and we get a snappy, satisfying main guitar riff. And James Hetfield's vocals blend in beautifully as they're cleaner than they were on St. Anger, yet still gruff and intimidating. And that feels good to say because from the 90s onward, James could feel kinda cartoonish with his delivery. Ever since his voice changed on Injustice for All, not counting that album, this guy has a tendency to go off the rails with some of his delivery, and it can be hard to take seriously. For example, there's this nugget from Nothing Else Matters, which Magic Mike has turned into a bit of a meme.
Oh, yeah. So close.
Yeah, I've been on a kick of this guy's videos lately. Death Magnetic isn't completely free from the problems of James being hard to take seriously, but it does feel like less of an issue compared to, say, Load and Reload. And on That Was Just Your Life in particular, on the verses, he's fast and menacing. On the stomping pre-chorus, he elevates himself even further, and on the chorus, he sounds like he's raining absolute terror on you. And yeah, throughout there are some questionable inflections, but it's hard to doubt its effectiveness. At its core, this is a song about failure, and how you can feel the way your failure has doomed you. If you're being told all this, you know that you have really messed up. And then the guitar solo happens. A huge problem many people had with Saint Anger was its lack of guitar solos. And I get it, Kirk Hammett is an incredibly talented guitarist who's delivered some mind-blowing solos throughout most of Metallica's existence, but when I listened to that album, there wasn't really that many times where I thought, man, this song could use a guitar solo. It's not that kind of album. Solos wouldn't have blended well with how bitter that album sounded, especially with that snare drum. In Death Magnetic, however, it makes more sense to bring back the ripping solos since it's a return to the band's thrash metal roots. And wow, this solo is satisfying. The opening is quick-paced and ripping, then eventually switches to some ascending trills with heavy wah-wah effects, and it's just holy crap. And we do get a smaller solo to bridge the third verse to the final chorus, but, like, at this point, you're not gonna top the first solo. And speaking of the final chorus, holy crap, those double bass drums. They add so many more stakes to this and make the end of the song feel that much more explosive, especially with how the song ends with the one complete mention of the song's title. You said it! We can all go home now. Except we can't, because there's still 9 songs left to go. And hey, this first song was so good, you want to keep listening, right? I hope so, at least. The end of the line keeps the momentum of the previous song fairly well, starting with a catchy cold opening with an awesome groove, and that later shifts into some octave-based riffs about 40 seconds in, and then that picks up more speed just a few seconds later. It's an effective build-up to the chorus that's varied in technique and doesn't feel cluttered. Other than that, there's admittedly not a lot I can say about this song that I didn't already say about That Was Just Your Life. This song is menacing, especially when the chorus guitar licks start to operate in thirds and James's delivery starts to get tense, but in a good way. And of course, things start to pick up again in the lead up to the solos, with the stomping drum pattern and quick strumming. And the solo itself, pure insanity. Pretty much the entire guitar solo is dripping with wah-wah, which I can see being a turnoff for some, but I personally love it. It also steadily makes its way up the neck of the guitar before descending and making the sound more crisp. Then it goes back up again and the guitar sounds like it's screaming bloody murder at the peak note. Now if that didn't get your blood boiling, I don't know what will. I might even go as far as to call this my favorite guitar solo on the entire album. And yeah, that's a bold claim when we're only on track 2, but my word is law. Okay? And around 5.5 minutes in, the track starts to get quiet. The drums switch to only hi-hats, while the guitar and bass get more calming and more rhythmic. James Hetfield croons the phrase, "The slave becomes the master," over and over again. The slave becomes the master. Which becomes an explosive transition into the final chorus. The slave Really, I'm a sucker for slow builds like this, and because of that, I could easily call this one of my favorite songs on the album overall. Though not quite as good as the opening track, since it doesn't have quite the speed and brutality of that song. But it does have an insane amount of groove and build that made it a standout when re-listening to the album for this video. I highly recommend it.
What don't kill you make you more strong.
Another one of my favorites on this album. I'm gonna say that about nearly every track, aren't I? I am losing a battle with my own nostalgia and I don't care. This is a song that sucks you in right off the bat with its somewhat abstract opening riff. I think when I first heard it a decade ago, I didn't know how to process it immediately. I think what threw me off is how it kept starting and stopping. Fortunately, the guitar playing gets a little easier to process after that riff. That quick plucking on the verses in particular stands out to me because of how angry it feels. The lyrics are about fighting back again and again, but to no avail. The previous two songs on this album were about being doomed to fail, but here it feels like there's a chance to strike back. Not much of one, obviously, since the protagonist keeps getting the crap kicked out of him, but it is enough of a glimmer of hope to make this feel like a fight song, especially with the double bass on the chorus. That's just fantastic. No joke, I used to imagine a music video for this song where someone becomes a prisoner of war and spends months working out to stand a chance of fighting back against his captors. Hey, I think it's badass. The solo here is also pretty technically impressive, mostly rooted in descending triplets. Personally, I don't think it's as good as the solos in the last two songs, but it fits the urgency of the song, especially with how it picks up the pace in the middle. All in all, this song in particular harkens back to Disposable Heroes from Master of Puppets, which is probably my favorite song off that record. Though Broken Beat and Scarred doesn't quite reach those heights, it does come close. A great fight song and war song, and I'm glad this was chosen to be the final single from the album. It was a good pick, and it was fast and engaging enough to be a potential force on rock radio. But now, I think it's time for an old Metallica tradition. For better or for worse. On most Metallica albums, it's customary for the fourth song to be a ballad. For example, one on Injustice for All, The Unforgiven on the Black Album, Welcome Home Sanitarium on Master of Puppets. Sometimes these songs have the potential to be among the best songs on the album. Here, it's the opposite. I think this is the weakest track the album offers, and it was the lead single to boot, so that's even more confusing. It's a Metallica ballad, so what went wrong here? Well, not that much, actually. In fact, I'd argue that the guitars that open this up sound pretty good. They're very rhythmic, and the clean guitars blend together nicely with the distorted guitars. However, this is where you can start to realize just how cheaply produced the snare sounds. This is actually a problem on the rest of the album too, but here it's more noticeable since there's not much sound going on to drown it out, and the way it blends with the bass here feels off. Of course, that's a pretty minor gripe I have with the production of this record. I still do genuinely love this album despite that production issue, but on this song in particular, I don't think James has really given it his all. When he starts his first verse, he sounds a little out of it. He's not gruff here, and he doesn't sound like he has a clear idea of the melody he's supposed to be singing. And I think that comes down to this being the first big ballad like this Metallica attempted since James's voice changed. So it doesn't feel entirely natural to me yet. I mean, his voice changed on Injustice for All, really, but I consider that kind of transitional. In between his higher voice from the first three albums and the gruffness he's displayed since the 90s. Thankfully, he does pick up some steam in the chorus as the distortion kicks in and James elevates himself to match. It's a decent chorus, but not exactly sending chills down my spine like the chorus of Welcome Home. And remember earlier when I mentioned how cartoonish James can sound nowadays? Well, it's pretty noticeable here, especially on the bridge before the guitar solo. It doesn't start out too bad, even if the phrase, love is a four-letter word, is a bit odd. But when he starts saying this, I swear, it becomes impossible to take seriously. This is supposed to be a climactic moment right before him and Kirk start absolutely shredding, but it sounds too goofy for its own good. The solos themselves, though, they're alright, though the trills are a bit choppier than I'd like them to be, but there's some impressive stuff on display here, like there always is when Kirk's up to bat. So overall, I still do like this song, but it does have the most glaring issues of any song on this record. But as long as Until It Sleeps exists, it's nowhere near the worst Metallica ballad. And besides, for this video in particular, it can only go up from here. I could probably comfortably call this the best intro to any song on Death Magnetic. You see a title like All Nightmare Long and hear what the opening sounds like, and you're thinking, ah, yeah, I see what you did there. Listen to just how eerie that guitar lick sounds. Now that's just tense, isn't it? Then the fast drumming and pounding toms kick in, and you know you're in for a wild ride from beginning to end. And the way James steps into the song with the phrase, "luck runs out," you can tell this is a song that wants nothing more than to make you feel dread. Arguably more so than any previous song on this album. It's heavier than the last 4 tracks, and the narrator makes it absolutely clear. He wants you dead. Potentially through your nightmares. So basically this is a Nightmare on Elm Street song. Awesome, right? Solo was awesome as you'd expect, lots of technically impressive strumming that peaks out toward the end in spectacular fashion, and then you bridge that into a second solo before the final chorus, one that rips even harder than the first solo. Yeah. Awesome! Other than that, there's not much I can say about All Nightmare Long that I couldn't about most of the other songs on this album, so I guess I'll give special attention to the video and how it details a very bloody zombie apocalypse that fits the tone of the song remarkably, even with the dated CGI, though I choose to assume it's dated on purpose. Anyway, this was the second single from the album. That was a good choice. It's not quite one of my favorites from this, but it has enough strengths where I can say this was a good choice. So let's move on to a song that I might call one of my favorites. Even though this is supposed to be about feeling sick and poisoned, I get some strong Army vibes through this. The way the drums and guitar stomp together in the opening along with those effects just scream marching line to me. And Robert Trujillo's one-note bass line drives it even further, which, by the way, I love. Something about the way this is compressed gives it a lot of meat. It's as gritty as I like a bass line to be every now and again, and it's bouncy even though it's one note. Kinda makes me wish it was a little more complex now that I think about it. But fortunately, the guitar licks built around the bass line are driving and catchy. In fact, this is probably the catchiest song on this album. That's probably why it sticks out to me so much. Well, that and the lullaby-like bridge, which is not meant to be an insult, by the way. I think the way they transition into this bit is well executed, immediately preceding this part of the song with Harcher playing to juxtapose the parts together. It makes this part tantalizing, you know? Like a poison that's meant to be attractive but is really destructive when you actually take it. Admittedly, this guitar solo isn't among the more impressive solos on display, but it rides the groove incredibly well, and it has a stellar, lightning-quick ending. And I love how it shifts back to the pre-chorus riff but steadily goes up. Now that's how you add variety to your riffs. I don't know what else to say. I mean, if they were able to make their thrash metal sound this bouncy and fun, what did we need load and reload for? I want more of this, please. Stick it in my food. And I'll get someone to taste my food because I can't be eating food laced with cyanide. That'll kill me. And then when the taste tester dies, I throw the food out and never trust whoever gave it to me again. Yeah, that wasn't the best analogy for the song, was it?
It's just the funeral I've been waiting for. Cyanide.
Yep, a third Unforgiven song, supposedly a continuation of the storyline presented in the Black Album and Reload. Except, the first time I heard this, I hadn't heard any of the other 2 Unforgivens. Yes, I heard this before the Unforgiven 1. How is that possible? I don't know. All I do know is that this is not only the best of the Unforgivens, it's the best song on this album. I'm not joking. This album boasts 2 ballads. One of them is the worst song on the album, and the other is the best. How did that happen? Well, let's start from the beginning. If you've followed me for a while, you'd probably know that I'm a sucker for ballads, especially ones that deal with dark or depressing themes well. And just... wow, this takes me places. The song opens up with piano and strings and horns, most of which are instruments no other Metallica song has. Not even the S&M concert boasted a piano, at least I don't think. This piano makes me want to get into a fetal position and die. In a good way. Yeah, that's the thing I can say. Even when the guitars start to play, it's really depressing. Already we're starting on a much better foot than the day that never comes. And while the verse kicks in, goddamn.
How could he know this new dawn slide would change his life forever?
The This is obviously taking after the first Unforgiven more than the second by having the verses be heavy and the chorus be softer, and considering a chorus is usually supposed to be a focal point of a song, I can only imagine that that's difficult to get right, but this succeeds with flying colors. I think what helps is how utterly bleak the verses are, feeling yourself fade away and in general just shriveling up and dying, not just in the sound but in the writing. James sounds scared and angry, and that turns into him sitting in a corner to be attacked by his own insecurities.
How can I blame you when it's me I can't forgive?
How can I blame you if it's me I can't forgive? This line hits with so much intensity. It's somewhat of an emo line, and without proper context or build, it can feel corny. But even without putting it in the context of the songs this is a sequel to, this feels much more staggering. And it gets even more heartbreaking in the bridge as James repeats the phrase, forgive me not. And with how the music swells in the build-up to the intense guitar solo, this is one of the most powerful moments on the entire album, and that is saying a lot. Now compare this with the other two Unforgivens. The first song is fine enough in its own right and has a fair share of sadness, but it doesn't have the same level of theatrics as 3 has. Plus, as far as ballads on the Black Album go, Nothing Else Matters blows it out of the water. The second song suffers a lot of the same problems as most of the other songs on Reload suffer. The production is muddy and it's not exactly memorable or heartbreaking. 3 is a song that branches out from what its predecessors did, even to the point of axing the what I felt, what I've known line both other songs had in their chorus. This goes in an entirely new direction, and it's one of the best things Metallica has ever done for that reason. And that's probably a controversial opinion, is it? You're not supposed to have those on the internet, I don't think. Or maybe you are. I don't know. Back into the heavy and fast stuff. I really do like this song, but there's not really a lot to talk about with it, aside from, I guess, the lyrics. The Judas Kiss refers to a moment in the Bible where the disciple Judas kisses Jesus to get him arrested. This isn't the first time Metallica have used Christian imagery in their music. Take a look at Creeping Death from Ride the Lightning, which is all about the Passover. Here I'm assuming it's less literal, more a symbol of betrayal or temptation. That's what I'm gonna go with. As for the song itself, I love the heavy, groovy riff. I love how brutal James sounds on the chorus. I love the solo, especially when it gets to the descending triplets. Also, this interlude from James is just amazing. Just listen.
Judas lives, recite this vow. I've become your new god now.
That's just badass. And of course there's the bridge right at the end of the second solo where we get a groove of toms and James gets gradually more intense, leading up into the final chorus.
Find a piece of me in all.
If anything, I think James sounds better here on this song than he does anywhere else on the album. His gruff delivery is mixed about as perfectly as possible, and it helps this song stand out even more. So yeah, great stuff. Not quite among my favorites on the album, but it's got a lot of replay value, unlike this next song. Here's a long-forgotten tradition, an instrumental track. I believe this was the first instrumental song Metallica had made since To Live Is To Die from And Justice For All, and I'll be honest, these aren't usually my favorites on Metallica albums. There's a good novelty in these guys just jamming out, but I don't think it really brings out their A-game. They're long with many different instrumental parts, making it a little hard for them to stand out. Anesthesia pulling teeth from Kill 'Em All is an exception since it's a bass solo, and Orion from Master of Puppets is an exception too because of the bass solo. Man, I can only imagine how heartbreaking it must have been to lose Cliff Burton back in 1986. Anyway, with that being said, I don't think that Suicide and Redemption is a bad song. Far from it. The guitar riffs are solid and it has some fun guitar solos, but the problem is that it's really long. Nearly 10 minutes, one of the longest tracks Metallica has ever recorded. Or I should say, had recorded, at least until... The first few minutes of this song feel pretty repetitive because they use a simple guitar riff with little change or build, so it takes a little while to get to what I consider the good stuff, which is ushered in by a mini bass solo by Robert Trujillo.
After some more riffing, we get some trade-off solos from James and Kirk, and I can at least say they're somewhat worth the wait, even if there are more impressive solos on this project. Anyway, here's a random bit of trivia. There are actually 3 versions of this song. The album version features solos from both James and Kirk, but there are 2 additional versions released exclusively for the Guitar Hero DLC versions of the album, Suicide and Redemption KH and Suicide and Redemption JH. Obviously standing for Kirk Hammett and James Hetfield, respectively. KH features an extended version of Kirk's solo while omitting James's, while JH does the same for James. I guess that's a nice touch, a little bonus material for this song, even if it's in a format you can no longer purchase because of licenses expiring. I feel so old. As for which version I prefer, I think I'm gonna give it to Kirk here. I think his solo is more technically impressive. It shreds faster and brings out more of that squealing guitar sound that I've been a sucker for on this project. Sorry, James, your solo is still great, but come on, you can't compete with Kirk. But now that we're done with the longest song on the album, it's time for the shortest song on the album, which also happens to be the album closer.
I feel like it's sort of a tradition to end most Metallica albums with the most brutal track. You have Damage Inc. on Master of Puppets, Dyer's Eve on Injustice for All, All Within My Hands on Saint Anger, and My Apocalypse is no exception. It's the shortest track on the album at just 5 minutes, and it takes advantage of every second to just rip everything to shreds. The opening riff and tom rhythms make it feel like a tank is riding through, and that feeling gets even more intense when the fast hi-hats come in. James's vocals are much rougher here than they were on the Judas Kiss, kinda to the point of cheesiness, and I love it so much. We even get an album title drop in the second verse. So that's where the name comes from. And he goes absolutely insane on the bridge leading up to the solo. He's practically rapping here, and the way he shouts at the end is oddly satisfying, and the solo that follows it is one of the fastest on the entire record. Awesome. I remember reading a review for this album on iTunes a long time ago claiming that this was at least somewhat similar to the style of Saint Anger. I'm not sure I really agree with that in full. It is more polished and rhythmic than anything on Saint Anger, but it does make sense in the fact that this is still pretty raw and angry compared to the rest of the album, and even some of James's delivery is similar to his vocals on Saint Anger. Why am I bringing this up? Because I like comparisons. And I like this song. Only problem, this doesn't feel like an album closer. Since it's the shortest on the album, it doesn't feel like the grand finale that it should. It's still the most brutal song on the album, but that doesn't mean it should be the last thing you hear. You know what should be the last track? The end of the line. Not only does that have end in the title, it also has that slow build after the solo that implies some kind of finality. It feels epic and grand in a way My Apocalypse doesn't quite feel. But as an album track on its own, I still love My Apocalypse. And you know what else? I love this entire album. Listening through this in 2018, 10 years after its release, as well as with the context of the rest of Metallica's discography, I can still say that I love this album to bits. As an adult, I do notice some flaws that I either didn't notice or was willing to overlook, but that doesn't change how utterly blown away I was listening to this. It's Metallica doing what they do best. Unrelenting thrash metal. The guitar riffs are tight, Lars's drum work is brutal, Robert Trujillo's bass work makes a good first impression and fits the style of the album to a T, and the solos are phenomenal. Is the sound a bit compressed? Yeah, in places. Is the vocal work a little wonky in some areas? For sure. Do the songs blend together at times? Maybe. But as someone who grew up with this record, I think it still stands the test of time and is an underrated gem of Metallica's discography. And I mainly say it's underrated because I never see people talking about it. And also because Metallica themselves don't seem to play any of these songs live anymore, outside of practice room jamming. Now that's a shame. I would love it if they could fit Cyanide or That Was Just Your Life or All Nightmare Long on their set list. But I guess it's hard to complain when you're still getting one in Master of Puppets at every show. If you like thrash metal and you haven't heard this before, please give it a listen. It's very much worth your time. It's got everything you could really want from a modern Metallica album, and it marks a return to form for the band after 2 decades of experimentation full of ups and downs. And honestly, I think it's way better than Hardwired to Self-Destruct. I may prefer Master of Puppets than Injustice for All, but Death Magnetic shows that even in their old age, Metallica are something special. I'm sick of EOT1, album reviews are hard to script out and make, and take care. Hey guys, thanks for watching my first official album review. I may do more depending on if I feel like I have a lot to say about a certain release, either new or old. We'll just have to wait and see. Worst of 2008 is next, and take care.